So welcome back to the show. So I have a very interesting guest today. In fact, it's very very close to home. He is actually part of my larger SE team. So I have Daniel on the call. So Daniel, why don't you introduce yourself?
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Charles. Yeah, so this is Daniel. As what Charles mentioned, I work under Charles' team. Taking care of enterprise business in VMware, right? So some of the large customers that you can imagine in Singapore, right? That enterprises, successful enterprises, right? I'm the one who actually helped them to solutions, stuff, right? Of course, I work in VMware, so I have to kind of solution the stuff based on what the VMware has told me to do. But yeah, but that is what I do day in and day out. Yeah.
Awesome, man. I mean, for those who are on the call is wondering why Daniel is on the call today. It's very very interesting because as many of us know, Singapore is fairly small as a country, so remote working is it's very doable, but not necessarily the most exciting things. Given that we are 40 kilometers, end to end of the island. But what's interesting with Daniel's work scenario at the moment is he's back home in Kuala Lumpur in Malaysia with his family, and because of all the travel restrictions that we have, he's actually working from home. And when the definition of home this time is actually quite far away, and at the same token, he's covering and supporting our customers in Singapore. So hey Daniel, how long has it been, man? It just seems like just yesterday you were here, and then
Yeah.
now is. I mean, for me, I've not been in the office for 8 months. But what about you?
Yeah, so for me, really, this all started in May, right, when I decided to make a decision to to be with my family, right, more often, right. So that's where I took the effort to go from Singapore to Kuala Lumpur, right. So I have to went through all that 14 days quarantine in a hotel and double swab tests just to prove that I'm okay, right. So that being put aside, at the beginning, I think it is really quite interesting, right? Like what you said, is a bit away from, I'm supporting the customers, right? Like what I just mentioned at the beginning. So to support the customers, the traditional context is that we really have to be with the customer, right? And usually face to face, sit down side by side, do a lot of whiteboarding, as what the normal system engineers would do, right? And then so that the customer can visualize better. But this all has changed, right? Since I kind of make that trip back to Kuala Lumpur and then still supporting my customers in Singapore, right? So I realized that there are a couple of stuff that need to change, right? So the first one is really that communication style that you are so used to, right? So in the past is we use WhatsApp a lot in Singapore, right? I think everybody do that, right? With the customer that you're familiar with. In the past, it's always, hey, do you have time for coffee, for example, right? So then you set a time and then you go down there to pay a visit, and then you talk about some stuff. But right now, since I'm away, right, the first thing that I would do is to try another way of building that rapport through, even though I'm using WhatsApp, it's still the same communication platform. But right now, I've got to put more richer context into my WhatsApp messages, right? So such as, I got to watch some news, right, that is popping up in Singapore, for example, right, or some interesting news that everybody is talking about, right. Then we'll usually start with that conversation on WhatsApp first, just kind of bring that closer, and also take this opportunity to check with the customers how are they doing, right, on their side, because everybody is still getting used to this situation, not just myself, and I think everybody, even if you're in Singapore, I think there are certain lifestyle that you're trying to get used to, right? So you just kind of chit chat with the customers and check out how they are doing on their side as well, and then that opens up the conversation to some of other things. It can be related to work or it can be related to other things as well. Yeah.
Yeah, it's interesting, that you mentioned, hey, you check out your customers and whatnot. I mean, obviously, we in Singapore and a very Asian community, still a relationship sales, it's quite a big thing still. So, I mean, how's the rapport so far? I mean, do they actually know that you're actually based in KL, or, you just kind of assume, or they don't really know at all, or what's the situation there?
Yeah, good. That's a good point, Charles. So it depends on your relationship with the customers, right? That's my view again, right? So if for those that really, the operation level that I'm so close to, I think I'm more than comfortable to tell them where I'm at, right? So that they also know that they can't be having coffee with me, right? So that's one group of people that I'm close to, and I have to tell them. So we build a rapport in a totally different way, right? So we talk about some other stuff. We even chit chat about the situation on both countries, for example, right? So I'll joke about it with my customers, like, hey, how is it in Singapore now? How is it on your side? And stuff like that. And then he will ask me the same as well. How was the things here? Because I think it's just curiosity now that nobody can travel across, right? I mean, it's not easy to travel across. So it's kind of interesting to share that insights of both countries and how it looks like, right, on the both side. So that's one
So
group.
speaking of, I mean, sorry to interrupt, but
No,
speaking
no,
of
no, please.
situation, like in Malaysia and Singapore, how is it like at the moment in KL? I mean, at least I see the news. It seems like it seems Malaysia is a little bit coming back to normal, very much so. So what are you experiencing in KL?
Yeah, so I think it's a bit, so to speak, quite relaxed already, right? That from what I observe, right? That is one word that I can use it to sum it up, right? Because I think it's relaxed to a point that you need to start get worried, right? Because everybody just kind of flock out to eat. You go to eateries, right? It's flooded with people. If you go to supermarket as well, I think it is flooded with people. Everywhere that you go, right? You kind of get back the old KL that you kind of used to, right? Because everybody just everywhere, and the only difference is everybody is with a mask on, right? Because of the regulations and requirements. So I think that also remind us that to always stay vigilant, because now the government has to step in and also remind people from time to time. If you kind of buy all the newspaper in Malaysia, one interesting thing is the government really put some efforts into putting that message on the very visible part of the newspaper, whether you're reading online or whether you're reading offline, right? It's like, please wear your mask, don't go out if there is no necessity, and just try and stay at home, right? Yeah.
So, I mean, obviously, your typical day would be very different today than it was, maybe about
Yeah, it is.
6, 7 months ago. How would you describe your typical day would be? I mean, at least for me, I know it's like, from bed to desk in like 10 minutes, right? And I don't necessarily wake up. Okay, like, I still wake up quite early because I need to send the kids to school. But short of that, I have a lot less prep time to get to work and whatnot. But I mean, how does your typical day look like in general?
Yeah. So I think to your point, I like your first point, right? Bit to dash, right? I think that is a good part of it, right? So at the beginning, you kind of don't get used to it, but after a while, right, you kind of find that you kind of slice your time in a more disciplined and controllable way, right? So in the past, you got all sort of reason to be stuck in traffic jams, like taking public transport from one point to the other point, and then some coffee session or face-to-face session take longer than usual, right? All this thing, right, seems to happen lesser in a virtual world, right? Because you could actually slice your time in the morning, like for example, really 9 to 10, I'm going to do this thing, right? I can block my time and I start to work on some work-related stuff. And then I find that you will be pretty effective or efficient in doing that because that 1 hour, since everything is working virtually, right? So you literally just work throughout that 1 hour. Then after that, for the rest of the slices, it can be a meeting with customers, or it can be like just like what I mentioned in the beginning, just building rapport with the customer and kind of checking with the customer, how are they doing, any new things that they need your help on, and things like that, right? So one thing I find is really, to sum it up, is really a bit more efficient use of your 1 day time, right? But of course, the things to get used to is that in the past, I also enjoy kind of, like meeting a lot of my colleagues and also my customers, once in a while, talk about some stuff. There are just some stuff that you will talk more about face to face, as compared to you dial in via Zoom or you use a WhatsApp call or Zoom or just any matter of a virtual call, right? It's just slightly different. Yeah.
Yeah, so it's interesting you touch on productivity. I mean, it's very debatable, right? Because to some corners, productivity has definitely gone up. To some, they feel that there was a lot of wasted productivity, so to speak, because now everything is a call of sorts, and we all know historically calls. Not every call is productive and whatnot. I mean, what's your take on it?
Yeah, so at the beginning, I have to agree with you because everybody is trying to get used to this new working model, right, or the new norm, right? And it's not easy, right? Because from face to face immediately to all Zoom calls or series of Zoom calls, right? Everybody just kind of block the call or the block the time just to have that call to sync up for another call, right? So to speak, like pre-call for a call, right? So yes, at the beginning you find that a lot of these calls are can be just shortened to an email, for example, or a couple of emails. But because we are human, we are so used to that interaction, right? So that's why for big and small things we have to schedule that call. But I'm noticing one thing, which is throughout this period of time, right? Like like what I say, I came back since mid-May. At the beginning there's really a lot of calls for or the pre-calls for calls, right? But it has been reducing in a good manners, right? Because when people build that trust virtually, naturally a lot of stuff, can be either through WhatsApp messages or through email, right? So we did manage to cut down some calls, and also the calls become more efficient as well, right? At the beginning, we are noticing that everybody just block 1 hour or even 1.5 hour, right, for preparations. But right now, what I'm seeing is that if people just want to quickly sync up and get 3-4 people together, they just need to block 30 minutes time and really just go straight to the point, right? And say that, hey, this is what we're going to achieve in this call, and what are we actually trying to come to agreement to, right? So if we have an agenda, I find that you can kind of pretty much get it settled within 30 minutes, right? Usually it won't, right? I mean, as we know, humans start to do some rapport stuff first, right? We talk about weather, we talk about the news, and we talk about other stuff first. That one take about 10 minutes already, right? And then the rest of 20 minutes is really into the work, right? And then kind of towards the end of the work, right? Another interesting phenomenon that I observe is people now, because they don't see each other for a long time already. So towards the end of the call, right, is usually some time being spent to round up the call in a good manner as well. That's another thing which I realized. They'll come back to talk about news. They'll come back to talk about some other stuff, right? Just to end the call in a very nice manner. Yeah.
Yeah, I think that's true. I think there's a lot more. I don't know. Maybe it's just the feeling of being isolated, and when the call ends, to your point, we tend to also check out on each other. How's the current affairs, so to speak. And etc. etc. And I think it replaces a lot of the water cooler talk or the corridor talk that we usually get at the office. So I think that's I mean, I see it as a good thing in a many way. I mean, to your point, also the earlier part about agenda, I think, as you may know, now we do our team meetings, I try to make it very snappy. And it's funny, again, right, you kind of hit it right on the nail there, where we say, hey, I'll talk about 10 minutes of the real stuff and the stuff that we want to discuss. And then we spend 30 to 40 minutes talking about random stuff. And I think we all kind of need a little bit of that interaction. And I think the video calls really, really help. I mean, I for one have never been big on the video calls, but I don't know what's your take on the video call thing. I mean, in recent times, I am a big fan. I think it really brings a lot of us closer in this time.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, one in general, right? I think one way that to bring people closer, right, is that first thing first, you gotta have your cam on, right? When you are doing that meeting. To your point, like video call, right? Because if you don't turn on your video, right, it's just voice call, right? There's no difference. So you get into the Zoom, everybody just can hear each other's voice, right? But a lot of times when I'm with the customer, especially, and it's funny. There's one funny occasion that when I go into that customer call as well, there is actually the VP, one of the the high rank officer from the customer side that actually say, I really miss you all, right? And I thought originally he said that because
Okay.
to his own people, right? Because there's
Right.
also his own people, own team on the call as well, right? So his team is kind of like, okay, turning on camera one by one, and they say, actually, I also miss the people that I talk to in the vendor side, right? So that includes the VMware side of things as well. So everybody on the VMware side, turn on the camera, and that call went really well because I think the high rank officer is kind of set the stage that I want to see everybody. I want to see the face. I want to see the facial expressions, and then we crack a lot of jokes there. In fact, that was a 1 hour call. I think we spent at least 15 minutes to talk about some other stuff as well, right? Just to just to bring each other closer, right? So that is I thought it's interesting. Yeah.
Yeah, fair point. You know what? Since we all both work at VMware, obviously it doesn't go without day. We talk about our remote working stuff, right? Our the remote working solutions.
Yep.
And just to set a bit of context for the audience as well, Daniel is one of our consultants that have so quite a bit of remote working solutions to his customers. And, it's just so happened that he is also kind of living the life of it. It's almost like a dog, you eating your own dog food.
Yep.
So, but there's this notion that remote working, I mean, of course, there's a lot of solutions suddenly out of the market, right? But net of it is that historically, the VMware solution, we always talk about remote working, and there's a misnomer that feels that remote working is for very, very large enterprises, right? So in your opinion, I mean, obviously you consult in the enterprise space and maybe would have done a little bit of the commercial and SME stuff as well. So do you actually think it's really a big boy play, or do you think everybody can somewhat benefit from, I don't know, a remote working solution of sorts?
Yeah,
VMware
that's a
specific, right? Yeah.
correct. Yeah, that's very very good question, Charles. Because in my opinion, right? Because I've seen how customer have used the remote working tool, and now that I'm working remotely as well, I'm actually using some of this tool a lot, right? Like what you mentioned, right? So like for example, I'll just take example, right? So the VMware, has something called the Workspace ONE, right? So the Workspace ONE is really to ensure that your laptop is securely managed, right? So like for example, I'll give you an example because in this remote working context, right, people are always with their laptop at home, right, for example. And then with your laptop at home, you're hooked on not to the corporate network, you're hooked on to maybe your personal network at home, right? So one of the very key thing is that how do you ensure that the software updates on your laptop is really in accordance to your corporate policies, right? Because there's just certain apps that, right, doesn't work well with, probably, right, with the latest release of the OSs. And typically, like what will we consumer do, right? What happens when your iPhone has a new iOS update? You straight away update it, right? So that's one example. So with what I kind of observe is that, the Workspace ONE actually try to test, the IT, allow the IT to actually test the software on the latest OS first before allowing the entire corporate to actually upgrade to the latest OS, for example, right? So to ensure that, a lot of these corporate apps are, compatible, so to speak, with the latest version, right? Because a lot of times compatibility is a big issue, right? If let's say a lot of the employees updated, right, and then they hit the issue of using the corporate apps, for example, then during this COVID time, it's very hard to go back and expect your IT to resolve it for you as soon as possible, right? Either due to this regulations of the distance measures and all this kind of stuff, right, that happen around the offices around the world. So that is one key thing, right? The other thing that I also observe from my customer is also the ramp up of the Workspace ONE enrollment as well, right? Because in the past, like what you say, is really maybe for reserved for a few users of the let's say the higher rank officers and things like that, right? Because they want their laptops have a lot of intellectual property inside that need to be secured, right? So those are the devices that are managed by Workspace ONE. But what we are seeing right now is that more and more, that is regardless of which function you are working at in the company, right? You kind of need that laptop being managed as well, right? And from a governance perspective, right? It put the IT team at a peace of mind as well, knowing that he or she has a full visibility and control over all the laptops that are being distributed to the employees during this time, right? Because right now it's not like, okay, I can straight away go to the IT at level 3 or level 4, right, for example, right? Because right now it's like everybody is from at home. Even if you want to get your laptop fixed, you gotta fix an appointment with your IT department, and you gotta maybe wait for 3 days, and you take your laptop, go to the certain place that, and then you need to wait another few days for the laptop to get fixed, right? So that's one thing. So back to your question about, whether this is really reserved for the big enterprises, I personally think that it does not, because either you are big or small companies, you also, the work style has changed as well, right? Even if you're small companies, there are just more employees that are on mobile, there are more employees that are working remotely, right? So as long as you're working on a mobile or you're working remotely, right, some of these mobility solution, right, example like Workspace ONE, of course, right, is going to be very useful for the IT organization to control their assets, right, and to make sure that the data leakage is another consideration as well, right? Because if you have a either you have a big company or you have a small company, right? Intellectual property is something that keep your company apart, set your company apart from others, right? That stands out. So protecting that IP is going to be one key consideration as well, right? So, you really want to make sure that the laptop doesn't leak out the data that it shouldn't be, and these are just some examples, lah. So that's why I personally believe that this mobility solution is for everyone. Yeah.
So it's interesting that you mentioned that. Obviously, I mean, I'm just putting myself in the lens of a small provider or a small user, so to speak. Obviously, the natural thing is, hey, I don't necessarily know if my technical guys have the know-how, and of course, the usual cost comes into play, and also the discussion of, hey, do I really need a workspace one solution like thing? Because obviously, with the world today, there's a lot of SaaS offerings, the likes of the Zooms of the world, and etc. etc. Is somewhat bridging the gap as well, right? So not too sure if you've got any thoughts on that.
Yeah, I do. I do. Yeah. So now, thanks for the question again. So one key thing to remember right now is, like, for example, a lot of these mobility solution, right? And again, I use Workspace ONE as an example because it's close to my heart, right? So it offers the SaaS and subscription model as well. So that's why I said, one of the key consideration when it comes to for the smaller companies, SMBs, right, for example, to think about is that I got to think about all those setup costs, right, all that infrastructure costs to host my, let's say Workspace ONE solution, right? But with this SaaS model and also subscription model, right, actually take away that concern, right? All you need to do is how many devices do you have, right? Because that will dictate how many licenses you need for sure, right? But because the whole infrastructure has been pre-set up for you on the SaaS, right, then you can actually use that solution. I wouldn't say almost immediately lah, but it's really close to that, right? You significantly reduce your setup time because you don't have to wait for the infrastructure to come in to host that piece of stuff, right? It's just like any SaaS solution, right? Like your O365, for example, right? You don't need to really now cater for server to host that O365, right? You just turn on the SaaS, right? So same thing goes to the mobility solution right now. What we are seeing now is the trend to go towards a SaaS for some of the small to mid kind of market, right? And then for enterprises, you have a more stricter regulations around. You want all the data to remain on the premise and things like that. Then obviously you would think about those traditional on-premise setup, right? Then that's perfectly okay. But I think the net point of this is that regardless of whether you are big or small, right, they are just deployment options that are suitable for you.
Yeah, I think I tend to agree with that as well. I mean, for those who are listening in, it's not necessarily like Workspace ONE catches all, right? I mean, I would like to say Workspace ONE can catch all, but I mean, we have seen customers that still, use the combination of tools, right? I mean, it's never one tool that suits everything, and we can use also Zoom, like to Daniel's point, O365, maybe Teams, and
Yeah.
it's just a mixture of tools. But I think the Workspace ONE solution definitely helps with that securing, the single sign-ons and etc. etc.
Yep.
Right.
Yeah.
So, I mean, I also kind of want to talk to you a little bit about, I'm not too sure how well you know the gig economy, right? Because there's a lot of talk about the gig economy where the rise of contractual work. Okay, so I mean, in the Asian context, we always want to hold down a permanent job, because we have always been thought about stability from a cultural perspective. When I used to work in Sydney, in my early career time, it never dawned upon me because in Australia the gig economy or the contractual economy has always been a very very big thing. And my fellow colleagues in Australia love to do contractual work because for them, they have a timeline. Let's say, for example, I sign up for 6 months and then I do 6 months work and then I take 3 months off, something along those lines. And then they move on to more interesting things, right? And they are never always tied down to one thing. But of course, me coming from a very Asian mentality was like, oh, I want to go look for a permanent role, right? And there wasn't too much in that time when I was doing it. But I mean, coming back to Singapore and ASEAN specifically, do you think that's going to change? Because I mean, at least from my perspective, I feel that with all this remote working, the fact that just you yourself, right, working from KL, supporting Singapore customers, maybe about 8 months ago was unthinkable, right? Because
Yeah.
I know at least our country leaders will not agree to even this even remotely happening, right? Because it's just like, oh, what about FaceTime? What about meeting customers? And suddenly here we are, 8 months later, we are doing this, and in my opinion, we are doing extremely well. To be fair, I mean, of course, it could be better, but we are not missing a beat, lah, right? So I just want to kind of get your thoughts about, do you think there'll be a shift in the economy in that sense?
Yeah, so that's a great point, Charles. I personally think that this gig economy thing, right, just got accelerated because of this COVID-19 thing, right, to your point, right? Because one thing is, of course, it has affected the job market a little bit as well, right? So there are more and more, maybe employees or ex-employees that actually shifted towards this cold gig economy model, right? So whether it's a freelancing or whether it's a contract workers, and also plus another newer generation of workforce, right, that just entered, right, and that unfortunately hit into this COVID-19 situation. For them, it's also about reaching out to just about any jobs that is possible virtually as well, right? So that kind of pushes up that gig economy adoption on the other hand, right? That at least I can see, right? So coming back is really this gig economy thing is very subjective to individual, right? So depending on whether you are, you're okay, right, to accept this kind of a job model, right? So traditionally, like kind of to your point, we have a Asian-minded kind of people. We are a bunch of Asian-minded people, right? I mean, I'm trying to generalize here. Of course, I know that there are a bunch of people that think differently as well, but it's just that having a stable job, with a permanent offer, is always the preferred choice, right? And some of the stuff that the working model that we are currently in is also kind of unpredictable as well in the past, right? To your point, right? How can you support a customer remotely, right? When you're in KL, you're supporting a customer in Singapore. Is that even possible? Can the new job being created this way as well, right? It's another thing that we can think about, right? But of course, I think even to say that it's possible, right? This gig economy thing is being accelerated, right? But on the other hand, right, it depends on the job function that you are in, right? For example, if you are in sales, right, it's going to be tough to go full gig economy, for example, because sales is a very personal thing, it's a very relationship thing, right? There's only so much that you can do on the virtual call, there's on a WhatsApp call, there's on a, yeah, even if you were to video call that person every day, right? The experience is just different between that and meeting them face to face. The ability to just see each other, facial expression in real, right? So that I believe that that sales functions, right, will still, they're trying to adapt to a new model, yes, but it has to be a hybrid, right? But for a lot of other jobs, right, I potentially see the shift to gig economy even faster. For example, the web design and development, some of the programming work. Because if a programmer or web developer, they typically what they do is they code, right? They code and they go according to the framework that is given to them, and then they start designing the whole website or they start coding the website, for example. Now, this sort of thing traditionally has been outsourced, but there's a problem with the outsource. Outsource typically is to a third-party country. That's number one. Secondly, is that it's still very the interest is not aligned because you do not really work for the company. You are just being outsourced, right? That's one example. But what is this interesting part about gig economy is that there is this part about you are kind of signing a contract with that company, but it's just a matter of how you work and how you get compensated are slightly different, right? It's on a contractual basis, it's on the hourly basis, or it's on a project basis, right? So it's kind of like outsourced, but it's not really outsourced, right? You still have that interest aligned with the company that hires you, right? For example. So I find that is like a very comfortable zone for a lot of the business to consider, right? Especially for some of the functions that you don't necessarily need to have that really close and face-to-face interaction with the customer, for example, right? That part of things will accelerate. That's my opinion. Yeah.
Yeah, I think it's interesting, right? Because to your point, the DevOps, the developers and whatnot, suddenly, with this newfound freedom, we are cross borders, etc., and you are now not even limited to developers within your own country. If you
Yeah.
think about it, right? You are the world's your oyster, so to speak, right? It's like, wow, you can kind of reach out to developers in the US and whatnot. And here's the plus side. I mean, coming back to the whole point of workspace ONE is security in some sense, right? The developers don't even need to code on their own machine, so to speak, right? They can code on a VM, or a desktop that's literally hosted, or an app that's literally hosted in your own data center. They remotely tap into it, with secure channels and whatnot. So I definitely think that in some form or shape, that's going to change our landscape and how customers consume tech moving forward. Hopefully for the better. I mean, obviously there are also detractors that feel that potentially, hey, you know what, we are taking jobs away from obviously the local community and the local citizens and the netizens and whatnot. But I think it's I definitely feel that the gig economy, to your point, is going to change the bulk of the job that could be potentially done remotely. I mean, another point is like things like system support, back end support, etc.
Yeah.
Sales functions, yeah, probably a little bit more challenging. I mean, as it is, customers don't want even to take our phone call on a good day. Now you want to have a video call, probably a lot harder. But yeah.
Yeah, and then technology is enabler, right? Kind of going back to the example that you used there, right? So the other thing that I observe, right, is there's some of this programmer or the offshore contractual worker, right, or the gig worker, right? That's the new word for it. They can actually use something like the VDI, right, the virtual desktop infrastructure, to really have their full desktop, right? Because for a developer, right, they usually want to have their full desktop with their own tools, with their how their desktop being designed, right, in their own way. So that VDI is also allowing them to have the full secure desktop that is hosted in the company data center. So all they need, right, is really just an internet connection, a stable internet connection that is connecting to get their full desktop, and then they can start working, right? Yeah. So this is
All right,
one thing.
man. So one last questions before we wrap it up.
Yep.
For you. So when are you coming back to Singapore?
Man, I really miss some of the stuff in Singapore, right? I have to be honest. Yeah, I know. There is Malaysia and Singapore always have this thing like whose food is better and where does this food come from, right? But having lived in both countries for quite long, right? I think Singapore, I'm a foodie, right? So in Singapore, I tend to ride my bike to try out some new food in Singapore as well. I can say that Singapore really do have a lot of good food as well, right? Even
I
coming
like how
from
that's
Malaysian
very,
come
very
back.
politically correct, but then again, yeah.
Yeah. But it's true, right? So I miss some of the Singapore food, like bak chor mee and the Singapore style bak kut teh and so on and so forth, lah, right? So all these things is very hard for me to get in KL as well, right? Or even not possible, right? Yeah. So and also the Ya Kun coffee is my routine when I was in Singapore, right? And I really miss that as well. I mean, they have good coffee here, of course, right? Don't get me wrong, but the taste is just slightly different, yeah. But yeah, I mean, back to your question, I really do hope to go back to Singapore because I'm in the sales function, like what I just mentioned, right? I do want to see my customers. I do want to meet my customers, face to face once in a while, right? I mean, probably not every day, due to this situation, but I still want to kind of meet them from time to time just to check in with them, how they are doing, and potentially, see what help can I render to them, right?
Anyway, I truly appreciate your time. I know we have been always been busy as well, as part of the larger team. I'm happy to have you on my team, and I'm also glad that you got to be closer to your family, and at the same time,
Thank you.
help us out here in Singapore. And for the rest on the audience, thank you so much for listening in. So stay tuned for the next episode, which probably should be in another week. All right, see you guys.